Welcome back to your lecture on soundscapes, or as I subtitled it, Sound in the Mostly Natural World. So today we'll talk about sound, natural sounds, sounds in nature, and human-made sounds as they interact with the natural world and also marine environment. Tomorrow, or the next lecture, will be more focused on sound in human-made environments, or sound and architecture. Just a reminder that I've had a couple questions about this, but the weekly readings are posted in each module according to the week and then under each topic for each module. So underneath each lecture, your video lecture, you'll see the readings you should complete before viewing the lecture. You'll also see a list of listening or video examples underneath that. And those should all be completed beforehand. This lecture will, I'm including some more videos that I would want you to watch. Since I can't include them in the lecture video proper, I'll have I'll have you pause the video and then go down and find the examples that I want you to watch like you were in a class. So first we should talk about sound. Maybe a review for some of you, but just so we're all on the same page. But sound is a wave that moves through particles, really moves through the air. If you have a vibrating body like a tuning fork or an instrument or even your voice vibrating your voice box, it's vibrating the air, and that's how sound travels. Sound travels differently through different mediums. And so later on in the lecture, we'll see how sound moves in the water, in the marine environment. It actually moves faster and can travel farther because there's more water is more dense than air. But as sound moves through the wave, it's compressing the air, and really, so sound is best described as a longitudinal wave, kind of like a slinky. When you compress a slinky at one end, it kind of compresses and decompresses along the line of the slinky, and that's basically how sound waves move. So sound waves are two factors determine what a sound sounds like to you. The amplitude of the sound wave determines the volume, so how much energy, how high those little squiggles are determine how loud the sound is. And the frequency, how fast the sound is vibrating, how fast the wave is vibrating, determines the pitch. And so you have pitch is generally measured in hertz, which is vibrations per second, or kilohertz, which is hundreds of vibrations per second. And so on your screen you have examples of a bass sound being 40 to 100 hertz would be a low sound. And as you move up, you're getting higher and higher pitches in the kilohertz range. So oftentimes we use the note A on the piano is described as 440 hertz. Every animal has a different hearing range, and humans have a fairly wide hearing range, but we certainly don't have the best of all hearing if you look at the animal world. So here's a nice fun chart showing basically the human range of hearing is about 20 hertz to about 20 kilohertz roughly. And that changes as you age. So younger humans, kids, can actually hear higher pitched sounds than some people, older people. And this has caused some controversy in the classroom, as young kids with cell phones can send high frequency sounds that the teachers can't hear. And I've experienced this in my own life. My mother had a essential oil diffuser that was making this horrible whining noise, and we walked immediately in the house and said, "That's terrible noise. What is it?" And she could not hear it at all. So it's an example of take care of your hearing. Don't listen to things too loud; it'll damage your hearing. And B, that we have a limited range of what we can hear. So I've highlighted human here on this chart. You can see the different animals have different ranges of their hearing. I find it interesting, actually, if you look at the chart, that mammals actually have quite a large range of hearing for the most part. And if you look at things like chickens or catfish and stuff like that, their hearing range is a little smaller. Maybe because that's possibly because of the mediums they're living in. But also the birds have a smaller hearing range than most mammals, which is interesting. So now that we've talked about general features of sound, I wanted to look at how different cultures and societies have understood sound and its relationship to the earth and to the sun and the moon and the stars and to the human body even. So we'll look at three different just examples of how this is sound has been understood. The first one we'll look at is the Greek or Pythagorean understanding of music or harmony of the spheres. And basically Pythagoras, if you remember, who's the guy who you recall from the Pythagorean theorem, which works with right triangles and angles and such. He studied in Egypt, and this idea about music and ratios and the relationship between the macrocosm and the microcosm probably came from Egypt and even Babylon before that. But Pythagoras, understood how if you take a monochord or a single chord and you strike it, and if you halve the distance, the string, half the string length, you get an octave higher, and so forth. So tuning or music or sound or tuning is based on these ratios that you find from a monochord. And these ratios were Pythagoras and people after him found ratios like this all throughout the world and even throughout the sun and the stars. And so one of the ideas was that there was kind of a musical hum that was made by the kind of proportions that between the Earth and the Moon and Mercury and Venus and the Sun, etc. And this wasn't necessarily a hum that you could hear, but it was a mathematical or even harmonic mathematical ratio and relationship. And so, but that it went all the way down from the kind of celestial objects to the human body. So there was a relationship between the harmony in the celestial objects and a relationship to the kind of health of a human body. This is a Greek idea that had a long life. But the idea of ratios and the harmony of the spheres also spread to other thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, etc. And so, for example, Plato in one of his Republics writings or speakings actually used a ratio in describing like a good man versus a tyrant, and he chose that ratio very exactingly. And I'll give you a little quote. The good man is living 729 times more pleasantly and the tyrant more painfully by the same interval. And 729 seems like a strange number. But if you look at it in terms of ratio, in terms of music, he's actually describing the tritone, the sixth power of 3, or that is about 6/5 of a fundamental tone. And in Western music, and even back in Greek, the tritone was considered as the most discordant thing. So what he's saying is the relationship between a good man and a tyrant is it's the most discordant thing if you're a tyrant. So I thought I'd just play you a trichord in case you a tritone in case you didn't know what it was. So this kind of musical thinking, this thinking about ratios, really permeated a lot of Greek thought and later thought as well. So the idea that there was a relationship between the stars, their ratios, and the human body was widespread. The idea of the harmony of the spheres really kind of morphed into a later idea that influenced a lot of European composers, especially in the Baroque era. So this kind of relationship between music, sound, mood, affection, actually human health, was actually kind of codified in this something known as the doctrine of the affections, which is an idea about how music and sound directly shape the human humors or the human health. So it was really prevalent in the music of Bach and Handel, and the idea was the doctrine of affections described how certain musics elicited certain emotions and changed the body humors, and the emotional impact that music had could really be physically felt in the body. This is in Europe. There are other places across the world that have a similar idea about the relationship between music and sound and the human body or emotions and health. For one example would be in North Indian classical music, there's a very strong relationship between the idea of certain ragas eliciting certain responses in people and certain emotions. So the word raga, which is the raga is a melodic tonal system for composition and improvisation in North Indian music. But ragas, by their very nature, were able to produce certain emotions, physical effects, and even metaphysical effects. So there's one rag called Meghmalar, which is said to produce rain, while there's another raga called Deepak, which is said to produce fire. And actually, because of that, it's actually rarely played. Musicians have kind of aversion to it because they're worried it would produce fire in the human body and actually, be bad for you to do. So a lot of these ideas between sound and the human body and even metaphysical things, this idea can be found across many different cultures. The harmony of the spheres idea, or the idea of a relationship between the celestial objects and the human body, is also still being used today, really. And especially if you look at kind of New Age music and yoga music and stuff like that, a lot of the composers still ascribe to these beliefs. And so it's a long-lasting, and especially with its relationship to the doctrine of affections, was a very powerful idea that permeated music for centuries. Other cultures have a somewhat related but different concept of music and sound. So, for example, I'll give you an example of the kind of Confucian or Chinese notion of music and sound. And again, like the harmony of the spheres, music and sound were thought to affect the body and society. So music, discordant music might produce a discordant society. Really, to be a superior human being, you had to be able to listen to music and understand music, understand the tones, and kind of contemplate these things. So if you understood, everyone can hear sound or sheng in Chinese music. Everyone can hear yin or tone, but to understand that and to be able to contemplate that, the music in the Confucian ideal is to kind of make yourself a superior, noble, or highly educated human being. Also in Chinese music, there's a concept of her, H-E-R, which is harmony. And although Chinese music doesn't have harmony like the Western harmony we have, this her refers to kind of the harmonious or peaceful or pleasant feelings that music can evoke. And there's a direct relationship in Confucian ideals about music evoking harmonious society. And so the appropriate use or appropriate understanding of her really has an effect on the body and the society. This is very similar to the idea, the idea in the harmony of the spheres that society and the body are related, and they can be described and are influenced by music. And the third society I want to just highlight briefly is this kind of Vedic, the ancient Indian concept of sound and the world. And again, like the harmony of the spheres, again, like the Confucian idea, in the Vedic thought, sound is totally related to the harmony of the universe and the harmony of the human body. In actually Vedic thought, sound is what created the universe. So I'm sure many of you have heard the idea of the concept of Om or Om is thought of to have been the sound that produced Earth and all the physical things in Earth. There is a direct link between the material and spiritual realms, and sound is this kind of medium between them. Sound is a non-material source for the material manifestation of the universe, and it's also key in the Vedic thought. Sound is key to becoming free of this kind of earthly matter or the influence of earthly things. So basically the idea was that the universe was around, but nothing really existed yet until this god, Lord Brahma, spoke the word Om, and then from that, everything, all physical manifestation, physical things kind of sprung into being. So Om, the idea of the sound, is not only the creation of the universe, but in Vedic thought, the correct pronunciation of sound, the correct functioning of rituals is what keeps the world and the universe operating in a good manner. So we've talked about Greek, we talked about Confucian, we talk about Vedic Indian thought. These are all interesting ideas about how sound is intimately related between the universe and human beings. But it's not just that. It's not just these kind of other cultures that have this idea. It's actually quite Western too. I mean, if you think about in terms of the Bible and Christianity, in Christian theology, there's a similar idea. In the Bible, there's a quote saying, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So this idea that word and sound and kind of heavenly beings are related is really found in many cultures, not just places in the East, but also places in the West. So now we've discussed some cultural ideas about sound and how culture can influence the idea of sound and the relationship between the heavenly beings and earthly things. But let's move on to the idea, kind of central idea for this lecture is what is a soundscape? A soundscape is, very simply, the acoustic environment of a place. The sounds are generated in this area. This place can be generated by biological, geological, or anthropological agents. So you can think of bird song as contributing to a soundscape. You can think of the crackling of ice or the wind. It can be kind of a geological or geophonic sound, or human sound, anthropological or anthrophony. So there's three concepts: biophony, geophony, anthrophony, are sound generating agents in a soundscape. And soundscapes can be have been described as either hi-fi or lo-fi environments. And what this means is hi-fi environments are where you can determine or you can hear a wide variety of sound, that there's not too much noise. The ratio between the signal, the sound, and the noise is far apart. So in lo-fi environments might be described as a noisy construction site where really the jackhammer is drowning out all of the other sounds. You can't hear any birds, you can't hear people talking. So the idea of lo-fi and hi-fi is interesting, and it should be, hopefully these concepts are useful for you when you go out and do your soundscape observation. You can describe what you're listening to, what you're hearing as lo-fi or hi-fi, and you can also try to ascribe the different sounds you're hearing and kind of determine what is producing them, whether or not it's biological, geological, or anthropological in nature. So what influences what you hear in a soundscape? There's several things. The geographic location is one. If you're up high on a mountain or in a city, it will change what you're hearing. The physical space itself will change sound, and we'll talk more about this in the next lecture, especially related to architecture. But physical space, if you're near reflective objects, or if you're in a forest where sound is being kind of muffled by the trees and plants, that all changes what a soundscape is like. Who is producing, what's producing the sound? Sound producing agents also changes, obviously. So if there are a lot of people talking, or if there are only birds, or if there's a little creek running by, it will change what you're hearing. And soundscapes, most importantly, are also influenced by time. And that's one concept that maybe doesn't spring to mind immediately when you think about a soundscape, but if you think a little bit longer term, the soundscape changes throughout the day, right? So it's quieter at nighttime, typically where we live, than the daytime. But even longer than that, birds start singing at a certain point in the year, so the soundscape changes throughout the year. And really, as we'll see later in the lecture, the soundscape changes quite a bit, even through much longer senses of time. So all these four things are what influences what a soundscape, what sounds like. A lot of the writing and research on soundscapes is environmental or environmentalist in nature. A lot of the scholars writing about this have been really concerned about the intrusion of human activity into natural soundscapes. And so this idea of an acoustic ecology the soundscape of a place can offer clues about how healthy the environment is. And later on in the lecture, and actually one of the videos I'll have you watch, discusses quite a bit about how soundscape really influence the healthiness of an environment. So acoustic ecology is a nice way of imagining the importance, or it's a good way of recognizing the importance of sound on an environment. And just like with landmarks being part of our physical environment, there are things called sound marks that make up soundscapes. Sound marks are particular sounds that you'll hear in an environment that somehow recall the space or the place and kind of make it special or make it different from other places. And so sound marks can have kind of a personal relevance to you. Let's say you live in an apartment building with a fountain in the front. You can always hear that fountain when you're walking in your apartment. That's one type of sound mark. Another type of sound mark would be kind of the the church bells in other places around the world, really, chiming out at a certain hour. Or if you're in a different part of the world, you might hear the muezzin call to prayer, etc. So these are kind of sound marks that give you a sense of place, and they're really important. I think you should kind of think about when you're doing your soundscape paper, what types of sound marks you're hearing, and if they recall, especially if they recall any sort of memory or kind of emotional memories that are recalled by sound marks. One good example of this might be in my old apartment in LA, our refrigerator would make a specific kind of noise when it was running, and so I kind of knew I was home. And so in a sense, that sound mark from my refrigerator, which seems pretty pedestrian, that sound mark really kind of meant that I was home, that I was safe, I was in my apartment, whatever. And so it was part of the overall soundscape of my apartment. It'll obviously be different no matter where you are, and your own recollections and interactions with your soundscape. So I want to give you two examples of soundscapes from around this country. And if you have headphones on, it'd be best to listen to these because these are actually high quality recordings that have done by the National Park Service and an organization called LAListens.org. The first one is actually really in our backyard. This is a recording from Rocky Mountain National Park at Moraine Park. And this the recording was done at about 8:20 in the evening, probably right after sunset, and you're hearing a lot of coyotes and birds. And it's really kind of evocative of Rocky Mountain National Park. So I'll play this example for you. And what I really like about that soundscape is the layers, the kind of depth you really get from listening to the coyotes, listening to the birds. You can hear birds right close by, kind of rustling in the bushes. You can hear coyotes way far off, interacting, conversing, really, and you can kind of get a sense of the space. And so that's a great example of kind of a natural soundscape that has very unique features to Colorado, really. You wouldn't get that soundscape, wouldn't get that precise soundscape anywhere else in the world, just because of the physical location, the geography of the space, the animals involved, the time of season, etc. So a great example of that. If you're interested in hearing more of these kind of national park soundscapes, if you look up online, the National Park Service Soundscapes, you'll find tons of recordings of animals, of soundscapes, of rivers, of waterfalls, etc. It's a really amazing resource. It gives you also some information about where they recorded each soundscape. To contrast that, I want to give you an interesting picture of Boyle Heights in Los Angeles. Like I said, I used to live there a few years back, and I think this one is just as interesting in a way, but it obviously presents a much different picture of where you are.
What I love about that soundscape is the kind of texture and the timbre you get from the different cars driving by. You have a lower rumble of a larger car and the texture of the wheels on the ground. You hear a skateboarder, you hear some music in the background, maybe from a little shop. Really, again, another kind of a beautiful picture of a completely different area of the country, completely different soundscape. But this is the kind of things you want to listen to and be attentive when you're doing your soundscape observations. Try to listen for depth, try to listen for timbre, try to listen for familiar sounds or unfamiliar sounds. Try to also link this up with memories and emotions that kind of maybe are you can kind of draw on. They can be, because soundscapes are not necessarily always pleasant and relaxing. They can be quite jarring at times too. So again, keep all these kinds of things in mind when you're doing your observations for your soundscape paper, and particularly with the idea of sound marks in mind too.
Before we move on to a discussion of historical soundscapes, I just want to mention the podcast that I linked on Canvas. It's a podcast with talking with acoustic ecologist Gordon Hempton about the role of silence and the role of kind of natural soundscapes and how important that is for human communication, for animal communication, and for human health too. It's a really nicely done podcast that I would really encourage you to listen to the whole thing. It gives you a really great sense of, there's some great soundscapes played in that podcast, and a great discussion about the importance of soundscapes and silence in our lives. So that's linked on Canvas, and take a look after the lecture. So I think it's interesting to think about soundscapes and how they have changed throughout history. Famously, if you remember Thoreau writing from his cabin on Walden Pond, wrote actually wrote about the kind of difference in sound from where he was in this isolated area as compared to the towns or wherever he was coming from before. So soundscapes historically have been written about by many people. And I wanted to ask the question, were they quieter than today's post-industrial roar? And my guess is really yes, they probably were quieter, but they weren't quiet necessarily. So if you think about like pre-industrial towns, you'd have blacksmiths, working, you'd have church bells ringing, you'd have public, criers, people calling out for, fruits and vegetables, etc. So they weren't necessarily a noisy space like maybe the kind of low or kind of the background hum of cars and airplanes and machinery we have nowadays, but they were definitely quieter, I believe. And I think people were attuned to sound in a different way than we are nowadays. So it's been, before people had clocks all around, everyone listened for the church bells to ring out the hour, etc. That's an example of how people were attuned to sound differently historically. This is another example of how soundscapes change throughout time, and now we're talking about not just a day or a year, but many, many, hundreds of years. It's also good to point out that our soundscapes nowadays are a very recent phenomenon. So in the industrial age was started not too long ago, and so only recently, really, in terms of historic time, have our soundscapes been like this, especially in the West. So going back even before towns and before civilization, really, we can think of prehistoric soundscapes, and although we can't hear them anymore, people have surmised several things about prehistoric soundscapes. So maybe some of you have heard of the cave paintings in Lascaux, some of the most really elegant and beautiful art paintings done by cavemen, by prehistoric humans. There's a Russian sound anthropologist, Igor Reznikov, and he discovered that the density of pictures in a location of a cave is proportional to the quality of the resonance of this location. And so the cave's sound environment really kind of helped determine where these paintings were done, some of the earliest artwork, human artwork. And so a soundscape has quite a bit of power, especially in these caves, for prehistoric humans. And since we're talking about prehistoric sound and sound environment, I just wanted to mention that one of the oldest musical instruments ever found was found in a cave in Germany, a 35,000-year-old bone flute made from a bird bone, a vulture bone. And I'm going to give you a chance right now, when I'm done speaking, to pause the video and go pause this lecture video and watch the accompanying video about this Paleolithic flute. It's quite interesting, and it sounds quite nice. Yeah, they had a reconstructed flute that that Wolfhine is actually playing in the video. So if you want to pause right now and listen to that, you'll be listening to one of the oldest musical instruments found. So another fascinating relationship between sound and music and soundscape and landscape can be found in these Australian Aboriginal song lines. So these are really song maps, songs that were used to aid in navigation along with the stars and natural features. But these song lines were helped the Australian Aboriginals navigate and remember people and places that they had encountered in the vastness of Australia's landscape. Songlines are passed down through generations, and they've even been shown, these songlines have been shown to actually describe geographical features that have changed over thousands of years. So there's an amazing cultural, historical memory contained in these songlines. The songline routes that the Aboriginals used to actually traverse Australia also even played a role in shaping Australia's national highway system today. So they have a interesting prehistoric and modern kind of relationship. You find similar ideas about song and the natural landscape in other peoples around the world. For example, the Kaluli people, who you've read about a little bit in Papua New Guinea, have a similar tradition where they have songs that help them remember and describe the environment for navigation. So I would maybe also go back, and if you haven't already, read the or watch the video on the Kaluli kind of Papua New Guinean soundscape in the links below. This is a little short video that I think you should take the chance to watch. Again, it's linked below this lecture. It's just a short video about the songlines, the Aboriginal songlines, and I find it quite interesting. So pause the lecture now and watch the video example. As an aside, not particularly soundscape related, but I just thought I should mention that the use of music, or composers have attempted to kind of recreate the natural sound world. It's happened for a long time and happened frequently. So I've linked 3 different examples. I wouldn't say you have to listen to all of them, but go and listen to a little bit of each 3 and understand how composers have tried to evoke natural landscape in their music. So Charles Ives evoking kind of the misty raininess of in the example of the Housatonic at Stockbridge. Otto-Rainer Spiegy kind of evoking the pines outside of Rome, the kind of hills and forests outside of Rome, and Olivier Messiaen invoking really the Grand Canyon in his music. And so taking an example, just listen to them a little bit and see how music is used to evoke a sense of place and space. So soundscapes are not only naturally determined, the physical space and the location, but soundscapes are also produced culturally. So we have different rules about how sound is permissible and how it can operate in our society. So depending on the time of day or the places, you'll find different soundscapes. So for example, you can think of the soundscape of a church, or the soundscape of a nightclub, or the soundscape of a park with little kids playing versus the soundscape of a library where running and shouting is generally not allowed. So depending on the place and the culture itself, will influence what is acceptable, how a soundscape is created. So I want to give you one video example here from my travels in India. As a disclaimer, if you've turned your volume up to listen to the other soundscapes, turn it back down again because it gets quite loud. But this is an example of a culturally produced soundscape, and this is I was just walking with a friend of mine visiting down a street in Old Delhi, kind of the old historic part of Delhi, just down on a market day. And it's really amazing how the Indian Old Delhi soundscape would maybe differ from, say, walking down through a farmer's market in the US. So again, if you haven't turned down your sound, turn it down now, and I'll play the example.
Good quality fruits. They're good, yeah. What do you feel like? More water?
So it's a pretty intense experience. If you've ever been down there, it's quite loud horns, hawkers trying to sell you all kinds of things. And this was just a kind of the vegetable fruit market. But really fascinating how culturally soundscapes vary from place to place and from culture to culture. You can also see this in different cities in, let's say, in Spain, or if you have a siesta time where everything kind of quiets down at different times, or in different areas where, different locations where they have noise legislation. So as you can probably tell from the video, there is no noise legislation in Old Delhi, and it's quite loud and intense. But from place to place and culture to culture, soundscapes vary pretty widely. Soundscapes also have a pretty dramatic effect on human health. There's been a lot of research done about how noise and noise pollution really can negatively impact human health. And I'm referencing here this one, actually just one study from the World Health Organization. And I'll quote a little bit of it for you to kind of show you how sound really can be a problem for industrial societies in the West. This study was done in kind of Western Europe, and it didn't account for a lot of stuff in Eastern Europe. But to quote it from it, it says, "It is estimated that the disability-adjusted life year, or they call them dailies, lost from environmental noise in Western European countries are around 61,000 years for ischemic heart disease, 45,000 years for cognitive impairment in children, 903,000 years for sleep disturbance, 22,000 years for tinnitus, and 587,000 years for annoyance. If all these are considered together, the range of burden would be from 1 to 1.6 million disability-adjusted life years. This means that at least 1 million healthy life years are lost every year from traffic-related noise in Western European countries, including the EU member states." So all that said, all these kind of different years are kind of, of course, according to population, but really dramatic impact on heart disease, on cognitive impairment, sleep disturbance, which causes a range of chronic disease issues, tinnitus and annoyance, really. So soundscapes have an immense impact on the human body. We're now understanding that, and researchers and kind of acoustic researchers are attempting to design and regulate sound in a way that would be less impactful for human chronic disease. But human disease is not the only thing. There's a video that I want you to take a look at now, a short video about kind of the marine soundscape and what we're doing to the oceans with all of our shipping and things like that. So this is a video from Vox. It's 10 minutes long or so. So why don't you take a break, pause this lecture video, and watch the linked video about the marine soundscapes below.
So I find that video from Vox, although it's a few years old, to be really enlightening about what's going on in our oceans. We read about or hear about kind of noise pollution above the sea in our own environments a lot, and it's good to think about what's happening elsewhere around the world in places we don't necessarily think about sound having an effect. I really think it's fascinating to think about how maybe even if our coral reefs are being bleached from climate change and warming oceans, etc., the idea that the oceans are almost being acoustically bleached by passage of ships or seismic surveying, etc., I think is pretty powerful and interesting to think about. So I want to wrap up with asking a question. My question is, can soundscapes have a purpose? Can creating a historical soundscape have a purpose that is maybe powerful or powerful in different ways than kind of a visual recreation of a historical scene? Can designing a soundscape in a contemporary sense elicit different behavior from people? I think these are all interesting questions to think about, and maybe think about when you're doing your research, you're doing your soundscape observations. One example of this type of thinking, this type of purpose of a soundscape might be if you think about libraries, right? So libraries, you're always being shushed and told to be quiet. That's a kind of purposeful creation of a particular type of soundscape for a particular purpose. And maybe if you could think beyond those kind of obvious examples of quietness in library, etc., and think about how sound or the kind of enforcement of noise or sound in different environments works, and what that does to people's behavior. I think it's an interesting question to think about, and something you can ponder some more in the coming years. So thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next lecture.